morning also from Thessaloniki, Greece. I'm Anastasia. Thank you very much for having me here in this very important meeting. And I'm representing CEDEFOP, which is the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training. Well, when we started, let's say, exploring this very important topic on why, for example, micro-credential is important, we first, let's say, had a very important background, content background already in place, because we had said if we work in different areas, we have different strands of works where we are basing our evidence, and not only we try to understand what is happening with the skills, with the labor market, what are the skills needs, for example, what kind of skills policies are actually taken on board at the European level, but at the same time, we have a very concrete focus on the individual level, like, for example, what kind of tools are there to support individuals in order, let's say, to go into a more lifelong learning journey. But at the same time, we very much focus on the delivering of vocational education and training, and more broadly on this evolving qualification landscape. So within that, let's say, background and more general context, we wanted a bit to understand what is happening with micro-credentials, not necessarily with regards to general education, to higher education, but mainly focusing on vocational education and training and labor market related education and learning. So within that work that started actually back in 2020, we had three main, let's say, research objectives. We wanted first to engage into an extensive mapping exercise and understand how countries in Europe are conceiving, are understanding, let's say, this important buzzword, if I may say so, this important term, micro-credentials. So how the term is understood. At the same time, we wanted to see the links between micro-credentials and evolving qualification system. This is a very important aspect of the discussion, because we cannot treat micro-credentials as an entity or in isolation. We really need to see the balance, the link with evolving qualification systems and frameworks, at least in Europe. And that is why we wanted to explore this theme. Also, our focus was mainly on the added value, let's say the benefits for end users. And these end users can be varied people. They can be learners, employees, but also employers, vet providers, even, let's say, national authorities. So there are many stakeholders in place. So this was, let's say, the research work we had to do for 3 years. We started in 2020, and this first round of work was finalized in December 2023. Currently, we will be developing a new research, a new strand of work on micro-credentials. It will start in, let's say, around May, let's say 2024, and will again last for another 3 years. Of course, CEDEFOP is actually very active in, let's say, participating in discussions that are taking place not only at the European level, but at an international level. And we engage in a lot of discussions with other agencies, with OECD, with ILO, with UNESCO, and other agency institutions, let's say, that are in Africa, in Australia, New Zealand, and the US. So we believe that this topic is of a global interest and very important for our discussion today. Of course, when we started, we really wanted to understand whether this is something new, whether actually it's a kind of a novelty if we think about qualifications, or is it what I'm usually like using metaphors, is it a kind of an old wine with a new label? And what we saw, and of course our evidence is actually telling us that this is a kind of a phenomenon that is not new. It is something that is already existing. For example, if we go to the private sector and we see different types of industrial certifications, let's say different types of credentials that are already flourishing for different years, we see that this is not something new. However, this idea of focusing on a short training and learning, let's say, that is taking place either, let's say, when you are attending a short course or when you are actually working and you are in real employment, then this new way of making your skills, competencies, and knowledge, let's say, known is really a new trend. And I would say that micro-credentials have mainly arrived in order to address the limitation of a formal qualification system to do exactly this, to timely respond to what is requested by labor market. And I think this is why we discuss a lot about this phenomenon. Of course, what we see in our project is that all the different types of micro-credentials we have identified mainly are an effort to show better what is already existing, to make it more visible and somehow more recognizable. And of course, there are different issues and challenges here that we need to consider if we think about recognition. Of course, there's a lot of activity taking place at the sectoral level. We also identified micro-credentials in different sectors, like, of course, the well-known IT, but also in other ones, like in engineering, manufacturing, constructions, but also more broader, let's say, sectors like hospitality, human health, and social work. So we see the phenomenon is really getting ground in different areas in the labor market also. As I said, we were very much interested to understand what is the important balance and the link with qualification systems and micro-credentials. And we see that, well, although we would think that of course, these micro-credentials have a kind of a journey or a pathway to enter, let's say, a formal system. At the same time, we see a lot of proliferation, a wide variety of these type of micro-credentials falling outside the formal systems, or they are mainly operating, let's say, in the labor market. At the same time, we see that these type of credentials are not necessarily a kind of a threat, which is usually the concern from trade unions, from different, let's say, alarming voices that are speaking to us, but they are mainly here to act as a kind of an add-on, let's say, to what is already existing in the formal system. So in that sense, they are not here to diminish or to reduce, let's say, the labor market value of already existing qualifications, let's say the recognized qualifications that we have. At the same time, as I said earlier, their main value, their main benefit is that they try somehow to push a formal system of qualifications to become more flexible and more responding to what is needed by the labor market. And I think this is, let's say, their biggest potential. And of course, our important empirical evidence that was based on an extensive interview program, on a labor market stakeholder survey that we actually developed in 2021 and also in 2022, what we saw is that there are two main developments that are paving the way for including micro-credentials, specifically in national qualification frameworks. The first and the most important is the one related to modules, to modularization of qualifications, because we see there that modules are a way, let's say, or when we talk about modules or unit-based qualifications, they are an enabling factor to allow into a concrete formalized system also, the potential to micro-credentials to enter, let's say, in that system. At the same time, we see that qualification frameworks that are more advanced, they are already giving the opportunity to qualifications outside formal education training to enter, let's say, formal system. So in that specific context, we see these acting as a kind of an enabler or as a enabling factor to include micro-credentials in these kind of qualification frameworks. And lastly, we always need to consider that there are many challenges, many issues, and many factors. And well, out of the many that we have identified, I selected specifically the one that is a bit related to the unpacking of micro-credentials, because if we think about what is actually hidden behind the credentials sometimes, and we talk about the language of learning outcomes, which is an important principle behind, then we need to think that there is this kind of knowledge and skills and competencies that are there and for a holder, let's say, that needs to show at the end of a learning process. So in that sense, if we talk about units of learning or let's say parts, let's say of education training, then this might alarm us that it might lead to a kind of a more fragmentation of knowledge. But again, there are, let's say, opposing arguments in this respect. Now I will very quickly would like to show you a concrete example from a sectoral, let's say, work we have done. We actually wanted to identify specific micro-credentials in two labor market sectors. That was manufacturing and retail sector. Of course, these sectors were not selected randomly. There are main reasons behind, because they are, let's say, advancing. There's a lot of demographical changes taking place in the sector. And of course, we wanted to understand what types of micro-credentials we can see. Of course, the slide is a bit dense, but my idea is mainly just to give you a glimpse of what is actually happening in different countries in Europe. First and foremost, we see that even the micro-credentials that we found in manufacturing in different countries are not the same. There are different characteristics, but they say at the same time, there are common traits. One of those that these types of micro-credentials are referring to highly targeted, specialized type of training that is mainly designed around a specific occupational profile. So you see, this is a very important aspect we have identified only by zooming in on the profile and the content of this type of micro-credentials. We also saw that their main, let's say, common element in manufacturing and retail, of course, because this is a slide on manufacturing, but there are similar results for retail, is that they are indeed focusing on new and an emerging topic, like, for example, a 3D printer operator, or let's say a more advanced certification within the sector. We also saw that there's a lot of diversity in their duration. For example, quite often we talk about different terms. We use the term of nominal workload. And then, of course, we would refer the timing devoted to that kind of a training and learning. But at the same time, we would even refer to credits allocated to that type of credential. And of course, we observed a lot of diversity. We saw, for example, micro credentials that would last for a very short amount of time, for hours, or to some days, but of course ones that would have longer durations for 2 months, 1 month, or even more. So again, the different stakeholders in Europe are telling us that depending on their national context, they are the ones to select what type of, let's say, which type of timing will be allocated to specific time of credential, of course, within a sector, if we talk about labor market sectors. At the same time, we observe that there's a very varied mode of delivery. These type of micro-credentials can be offered either in person, online, or in a blended format. So you see there's again a proliferation of offering and a lot of, let's say, variety. And I'm very, very much interested that CEDEFOP and me and my colleagues, we have a very concrete focus on learning outcomes. We believe this is an important parameter not to be forgotten, because how do you really assess the acquired knowledge, skills, and competencies in these type of credentials? Is it actually based on this learning outcomes approach? And what we saw from this concrete exercise in manufacturing retail is that quite often these types of micro-credentials would describe, let's say, the learning outcomes achieved, but there are many other ones that do not necessarily make a hint or do not show explicitly, let's say, what are the learning outcomes that these holder would have. And I think this is something that is worth researching more. So this was, let's say, a glimpse of the sectoral exercise we have done. Of course, I mentioned that we try to develop a research report that is already published in CEDEFOP website about the added value for our end users. And of course, we cannot discuss about added value unless we talk about trust, because trust is an important component, and trust in micro-credentials can be said by different, let's say, parameters. Of course, I am showing this in the slide. One of those, of course, is very important, is related to quality assurance. Quality assurance mechanism is a key element, and quite often we see that end users are looking for some form of a quality label that can guide their choice, that they can see what are the concrete examples of how, for example, different providers or partnerships of providers have been, let's say, work together to create a trusted micro-credentials. And of course, even if quality labels are intended, let's say, to help users assess the quality of provision, we see there are different approaches to quality standards among different providers, and this is very important. We also saw from the mapping of retail and manufacturing that assessment is key. It's a kind of a crucial element to trust, and it is actually a feature that users strongly associate with the added value of micro-credentials, because the information about assessment formats currently varies a lot. Also, comprehensive information and guidance about where, for example, end users can find trusted micro-credentials is currently missing. So that is why we're discussing a lot about creating a kind of a framework for micro-credentials, well, at a European level, and also thinking about the future. Also, metadata availability and compliance, for instance, with functionality and quality criteria, are also key elements that we need to consider in order to understand and see at a horizontal level different types of credentials and how comparable they can be, especially if they are situated outside national qualification systems. So this was, let's say, important slide on the trust aspect. Of course, we did a lot of work on the strengths and the weaknesses of micro-credentials, but mainly what I wanted to show you is that getting things right actually is a balancing act. And our systematic approach to mapping micro-credentials in Europe actually supports the ongoing debate that is happening. And for us, well, an important message is that it is not enough to know what skills needs are emerging and what types of jobs will be in demand in the near future, but we also need to consider what is happening in vocational education training with regards to provision and how well that can be shaped to give people those skills and prepare them for the green and the digital transitions, for example, that we talk quite a lot. And sometimes there are other debates that tell us that micro-credentials can be a kind of a important golden solution. Actually, they cannot be considered a quick fix if we think about the unemployed or the ones left unregulated, because they definitely need to be trusted, quality assured, and of course compatible in the future with existing qualification systems in order to become drivers of learning and of course of the current transitions. And I will, let's say, finalize my short intervention here by a bit having this more futuristic perspective, because if we talk about the future, there are different scenarios that are currently evolving. And also we see these from different discussions we have at the European and international level. Quite often, different stakeholders, policymakers are discussing about creating a common European register of identified micro-credentials, and also other discussions are referring to concrete aspects of opening up national qualification frameworks to more incremental approaches that are based really on metadata knowledge and tools that can help us, let's say, compare, for example, or see the commonalities and differences with micro-credentials. But of course, what we see from the research perspective at CEDEFOP is that there is a concrete need to focus on more labor market sectors, as we have done with manufacturing and retail. We also need to understand better the profile and content of these identified micro-credentials in order to see whether they are placed in private sector, in the public sector, whether they're referring to non-formal learning, to learning that is within the formal system, but is not necessarily recognized and well, let's say, shown. I think this is an important element. Of course, recognition is a key element, and very much we need to embrace existing recognition practices that would give the opportunity to learners to share credentials even from a digital wallet, and also for us to see what kind of standards are needed behind and what kind of even accreditation processes need to be in place. And of course, in what sense these micro-credentials can be transferred across borders and across different systems of education. And I think this is an important part. And lastly, I would like to raise this aspect of inclusion. And of course, referring to social inclusion, because we see that there are different types of learners and workers, disadvantaged, people that are unemployed, people who do not have access to internet, to online learning. So these type of people need to be engaged in a lifelong learning journey, and we need to consider whether, for instance, micro-credentials can benefit those disadvantaged learners. Can they really, for example, be in a position to re-enter into what is already existing, not necessarily devoting a lot of time and money, but rather quickly being upskilled for their, let's say, personal individual journey. And I think this would be my final remark. Of course, CEDEFO has dedicated a lot of effort in producing a concrete project page that you can see here in the slide. We have already produced 2 different podcasts, and I'm just sharing the link to the current one where we're discussing with Professor Paul Granger from UK, where about, let's say, what is the future research on the topic. And lastly, we just published a fresh briefing note that is actually elaborating in detail all the different aspects I have mentioned. This is all from my side, sirs. I hope I didn't take a lot of your time, and I will be happy to hear the other speakers and any other comments in the chat.
Thank you, Anastasia. That was really good overview about what micro-credentials are, where you see all the benefits. And so I won't be covering those, which goes very well. What I'll talk about is what we are doing in ECIU and what are the lessons we learned, and that would help anybody else who wants to include or offer micro-credentials. I work for ECIU. I'm from Tampere University, a researcher, but I also work for on this project with ECIU. ECIU is a European consortium of innovative universities. There are 13 universities around Europe that are part of this consortium, and we offer micro-credentials for our students. We offer different types of micro-credentials. We call them learning opportunities because they can be many different types of learning opportunities we can offer. At the moment, we offer two different types. One is called micromodules, which are anywhere from 1 ECTS to even 7 ECTS. We call them micromodules, and we would like to keep them 1 to 3 ECTS, but there are still some countries in Europe where shorter courses cannot be offered. So the minimum they can offer is 5 or 7 ECTS. So we do have those as micromodules. And we also offer something called challenges, which is basically either from the industry or the cities where they pose a challenge and give it to the students to come up with different solutions. So it's our way of getting students also to work with industry, get familiar with industry, and actually get real work experience kind of a thing. So for all the learning opportunities, we do issue micro-credentials. We just started in the autumn. We are the first consortium to actually issue micro-credentials in Europe. So we follow strictly what EU Commission guidelines. Basically, micro-credentials are a record of learning outcomes that a learner has acquired following a small volume of learning. So whether it's a micro-module or a challenge, for each of those individual learning opportunities, we give a micro-credentials at the end of it. And it follows the learning outcomes. All our learning opportunities come with learning outcomes. And so the students know what they are learning beforehand. And in order to issue the micro-credentials, which is the digital credential portion of it, the students get at the end of the learning opportunity, only if they pass, of course. We do follow the EU Commission guidelines even for that. So this is more formal education related as well. Micro-credentials versus digital credentials is a totally different discussion for another day. But for micro-credentials, the requirements, the mandatory requirements are learning outcomes and who is issuing it, what level they are at, basically EQF levels, what type of assessment is being done, and the type of quality assurance. So all the things that we expect to gain understanding of what the students are learning and trust is should be in a micro-credential, and that's what we follow. So basically, we are as much as possible, because every country has smaller nuances of frameworks within the systems. So we try to follow as much as possible at the European level. So we use European learning model. The micro-credentials are issued as European Digital Credentials, EDC, which follow the W3C verifiable credentials data model. And we not only have the learning outcomes, that's the mandatory portion of the what the EU Commission recommends, we also have skills and competences that they acquire by taking these learning opportunities. We don't assess some of the skills, like transversal skills, working in teams, or being presentation, or it's in English language. We don't exactly assess a teamwork. All we can say is that they did a teamwork project for this particular learning opportunity. So for that, we align our learning outcomes with ESCO framework, and we include those skills into the micro-credentials. So at the end of it, learner can see that these are the standard skills and competences associated with this learning opportunity, and they can share as needed. As part of the ECIU, we also offer for our learners, they can actually visualize how their skills and competences are going up as more and more they finish their micro-credentials. So in different fields, at the moment, we are using 4 SDG 11 fields, as well as some of the transversal skills. We have a micro module for intercultural competence, because we understand it's so important within Europe if they want to travel to other countries to work or study and things like that. So they'll be able to see how their skill set is progressing, and they can also see where they are lacking some, so they can try to find micro credentials to fill those gaps. I wanted to cover, instead of saying, our research on what learners said, what they liked, or how it can be achieved, one of the main things to share are the lessons we learned, so that others don't need to go through it, or they can start here and say, oh, okay, this is something to keep in mind. So within Europe, at least, even in the rest of the world, they are using not European learning model, but the W3C verifiable credentials as a data model all over the world. So within Europe, we have EDC data model, which follows the same. And that is a key to use because it makes it easy for portability, because it's a standard protocol. For the European digital credentials, there are different ways of issuing these credentials. There are different platforms to use. Some are commercial, some are open source, some are, you can try everything, but the data model stays the same. And in order to issue a European digital credential and make it tamper-proof, you need to have a e-seal. And that takes some time and getting used to using it, how to use it, and all that. The micro-credential platforms, in order to build a platform and issue micro-credentials, you need the IT services. The IT adoption is very important, and it requires time and energy into it. And the platforms are still immature. Even the European digital credentials, it's still evolving. So it takes some time to get used to and work with it. The flow of data, whether it's a higher education institution or vocational school, the student management systems and where the courses are offered, they are all sometimes different systems. In order to gather all the information to put it into a micro-credential, it's not a trivial matter. It takes time. It takes a lot of effort to getting into it. Same thing with the metadata. Getting different information takes time. For us in ECIU, what we are doing is actually build a central system that all the 13 universities will enter the data for all the learning opportunities we are offering into that central system, so that from there, all the data is in one place, so we can issue micro-credentials easily. But as a individual institution, if you're offering it, you have to make sure that all the information can be gathered or integrated into the platform to issue micro-credentials. It went back, sorry. So next, we also need to look at what kind of proof of learning is required. Different micro-credentials, different types of micro-credentials need different types of proof. Definitely, all the institutions, whether it's employers also might prefer to have forgery proof. They should be verifiable. With the European digital credentials, by just opening it in the viewer, it can tell you whether its e-seal is broken, whether it's tampered. So it's some way of easily verifying that it is what it is. After it's given, it's not tampered with, is important. Is it just a certificate of participation? In which case, it might not be micro-credential. It will be a digital credential, because you won't have any learning outcomes and other mandatory information in there. But that's something to think about. What is it that the final goal for you issuing it? Do you just want to give a certificate of participation, or you want all the skills and competences and everything listed over there? What is it used for? Micro-credentials can be used for the gamified learning pathways, but there are also badges that are used, and they also carry information, but it is not visually seen. Like in a micro-credential, you can see the learning outcomes, you can read the learning outcomes, you can see the skills already presented in there. And how much proof do you need? Do you need other universities or employers to be able to verify them and issue credit to their students, or what is the purpose of it? And same going for within ECIU. Right now, we are issuing all the micro-credentials centrally. So the ECIU as a consortium obtained the e-seal, and they e-seal all the micro-credentials for all the 13 partners. Um, the e-seal does not mean that they take ECIU takes the responsibility for the quality of the learning opportunities or assessment or anything. It just says that the information it got from the universities, I am e-sealing it. The universities are still responsible for the quality of the learning opportunities, the assessment of the learning opportunities, and everything, the course content, everything the universities are responsible for. But to make it easy for the 13 universities, we do it centrally. And the adoption of digital credentials or micro-credentials takes a cultural shift within the institution and also within the nation. There are countries just starting to think about micro-credentials. In that case, the institutions who wants to offer, it takes a little bit more effort because it also requires, depending on the path the national movement is taking, they need to go along with that. And data and API integrations, it requires a lot of work from the IT side, as well as trying to find the right platform that they can integrate into their existing systems. And there's a lot of early adopter programs available. European Digital Credential (EDC), they offer early adopter programs. They give training, they give workshops. It's good to try them out to see, do a pilot program to do small scale, and then figure out if that is something the institution should do or a consortium should do. We have some papers published on, what are the features that higher education institutions or any institution who wants to offer needs in a micro-credential platform, and how it can be used, and also what did our learners say when we offered some of the micro-credentials. If anybody is interested in them, I can send over. With that, I will stop my presentation. Hopefully I didn't go too fast, but I wanted to leave more time for the round table as well.
The rare Kayla a hugter and a quishlon is what we say in Irish, which means little by little we build the castles. So you have to give me a little bit of time. So delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Gurmila Mahagwiva was to say in Irish. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about driving forward, what's happening in Europe, but also to take in some of the other perspectives, particularly, when we were preparing for this, thinking about some of the recognition issues that are coming forward from the ecosystem of micro credentials, because I think it's important that we can maintain that in our thoughts because particularly as the BREVET project is about recognition and how that recognition can be formalized or not formalized as needs be. So we know that micro credentials really, we have a huge amount of drivers that are accelerating. So in Europe, I think there's a sort of a just do it attitude coming from very centrally from the Commission, telling us to move on, get there. The supply side is being developed through a number of levers, both at national and European level. Huge amount of activity going on. And we have a numerous amount of projects that have been ongoing to try and get micro credentials stimulated within the wider education and training ecosystem, and then to permeate across into industry. And that is also embracing things of I suppose, the Commission and what we've been looking to do around, digitalization and green skills. So trying to tie in all of these sort of waves, as I call them, together, and using that as part of the digitalization, upskilling and reskilling. Well, also that dimension that Anastasia spoke to previously with respect to the lifelong learning and the lifelong learning aspects, which are really, really important. And I think part of that question around recognition and life-wide learning has to be addressed as well. I think we don't pay an awful lot of attention to that, and a lot of the when you do the analysis of the literature, a lot of the focus is on skills and competence development, etc. But we don't always take into account more some of the life-wide issues that we're trying to address, or that should be addressed and need to be addressed with respect to micro credentials. I think one of my favorite papers of all time, came out last year from the OECD, actually, 2023, March 2023, and they've had a number of publications to come out which have been really, really informative in the latter half of the year in December. But I think this one really reminds us, that the impact of micro-credentials. So I was delighted to see Anastasia say that they're going to do further research on impact with respect in the CEDAFOP, from the CEDAFOP research and future CEDAFOP research. I think that would be really, really important, because I think what we're always basing on for micro-credentials is that we're linking it to education training and saying that all education is good. Therefore, doing a micro-credential should also be good from that vein. That would appear logical, but I don't think we have, as of yet, the empirical evidence really to support that. So a little bit of around that would be hugely. Now, whether it's impactful, I suppose it's how it's impactful and at what level it's impactful, I think is also to work through. And I'm sure that there'll be more research done on that, and the upcoming CEDAFOP research will also add into that. So if I move briefly, we know what the drivers are. We know that there's a huge breadth of things that micro-credentials are meant to cover. Those drivers come from across the literature, upskilling, reskilling, employability, all of those type of things. And then we look to the education and training sector and what's happening. And we know that from large scale and small scale studies that a lot of institutions, particularly formal institutions, are aligned with these. So if we look at a small scale study, and this one comes from Canada, where we can see that access into education is primarily, into further education, is one of the key elements of why an institution would be engaged in micro-credentials. I think, and having attended a lot of micro-credential events, there's also a fear of missing out. So if I was to ask those questions now to many institutions, I would also put in a line there, fear of missing out of what potentially is happening with respect to micro-credentials. Anastasia referenced this, and I think in Europe we're becoming a lot better, and I think the European recommendation is really, really key in this. I think it has tried to balance out the drivers, and I think this is Jim Marchalier and Kerry who spoke to, who wrote a paper talking about the value of, and this was a response to one of the critiques of micro-credentials, which is essentially saying that these are a neoliberal phenomenon, out there to try and get us all just to be units of production. And this was around the notion of value and why the notion of value is important. So as you can read there, central to the challenge of developing a good micro-credential is defining its value. While skills development is often framed as the sole or one of the main motivations for micro-credentials, it's not the sole consideration. Other concerns may be about the public good, providing flexibility and targeted learning, and the cost of education. So I think we really need to think about this. And I think that in Europe we have thought and we've done a lot of thinking about what it's about. And for us, I think when we looked at this as part of ECIU, as part of one of the white papers that we had in 2022. And we talked about social participation and active citizenship, inclusivity and equality, environmental consciousness, and intercultural awareness and understanding. And I think if you look to that notion, you can see that framing happening within the policy agendas in Europe. So there is obviously the employability effort agenda and the lifelong learning when it comes to upskilling and reskilling. But there is also a life-wide agenda, and there's also more value propositions coming in there for people who are doing learning for learning's sake, who are doing learning that potentially is outside of formal education, etc. So we need to think about those and make sure that they're inclusive. Huge number of projects. There's absolutely global phenomenon and global splurge. It's like a sprouting field of daffodils here in Ireland currently, which is great. There's so many things going on, and it's nearly impossible to keep your head around what's going on with micro-credentials. And you can see they're all coming in it. I think the European definition is really important. The roadmap is really important. But more importantly, and I think this is what we should all be keeping our eye to, states will be asked or have been asked by the Commission to say, what exactly have you done with response to the recommendation? Where are you moving? So I think this is really important, and I think that is something that we need to keep an eye on, specifically while we think to the elements of how micro-credentials are supporting those notions of transparency and principles that we know have been defined in it. So again, I think from a European perspective, where we see from the literature it's all labour market, we're trying to get to this more balanced perspective of micro-credentials. The principles underpinning the European recommendation are really, really important. I'm not going to go into all of these, but you can see when you pull them and look at them individually, they're really important, but collectively they're hugely important. And I think what we've tried to do with micro-credentials from the start and from our engagement with them, independent of it being an old wine in a new bottle, and I think I know the person who coined that phrase, Anastasia, or particularly I think of it at a CEDAFOP event about 2 or 3 years ago. I think we initially have to really, really think about how we're progressing for this if we want to see micro-credentials as a new phenomenon with respect to education and training. And I think it's really, really important that we do that. We've done it in our own institution. We talk about and we developed this framework about thinking about a wider credential ecology, whether that's from alternative credentials further on to, and we've used this a number of times, and we've used this in many different cases to think about, to try and simplify in many ways potentially how we can do that. And we've engaged in a number of particular activities around that. And again, just in the absence of time, I won't go into all of these. And we have particular ones under the microcreds, the National Irish Initiative, that we engage with employers, and we work with employers to develop out micro-credential opportunities, but then we work directly with SMEs to develop out courses with them under the Digi Advance project, where we're working with leaders, we're working with also with employees and employers to try and work through what are the credential opportunities. I think for myself, if the question is what's next or how are we moving forward, I think there's a huge amount of nuance entering the frame and states. I think a lot of the technical and quality assurance pieces are coming together. Lots of work still needs to be done. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But I think we're definitely on the micro-credential brick road. And you can see in this image that I have here of a bumpy road, because it's not a clear pathway. There's things that we need to solve still with respect to quality assurance and recognition and issuing and all of those things. But I think that the pathway is leading to a lovely horizon there. So I think we need to follow that, particularly when we think about the rationale for engaging with micro-credential. And more importantly, when we think about the rationale where if micro-credentials are there to support individuals, society and economies, how that can happen. I think one of the key elements from the recognition part, and this is where some of the work CEDAFOP has done, it might be useful to think about it, and also the other projects across Europe looking at, and these are at state level and also at national level, looking at the NQFs. And we know in ourselves that all NQFs are not created equally. We know that there are NQFs that have been designed in a particular way, the Irish one in particular, from one perspective, where we already have qualification types that house micro-credentials. But we're looking to see how we rectify a situation where we don't want to have a micro-credential potentially equaling an award. And we know there's moves now by the QQI authority here in Ireland to look at that very seriously. And I think that's really, really welcomed. We know in other jurisdictions globally, they've already done this. And they have in New Zealand, they've already said from their qualification framework that a credential is a credential, and that's been called out across all levels of the framework. So I think looking to that notion of our ecosystem, qualification frameworks are really, really important. Delighted to hear the emphasis on learning outcomes. I think the translationary aspect of them, they're like to me the compatibility bits. That's the bit we have to make sure so that we're interoperable. Looking to the stacking and all of that of micro-credentials, we spoke to a little bit. We haven't mentioned it here today, but it's a huge element of it. I think we're a little bit off yet. I think there's other areas and regions potentially that are looking to stacking in a more nuanced way, because I think that they've had the capacity to do that at a regional level. And I think we need to start getting really our heads around what stacking could and should mean with respect to micro-credentials. We're grand when it comes to the unbundling of qualifications, awards and trainings, but when we think about the rebundling and how they can be recognised, etc., I think we still have a little bit to go on that. Again, as I said, not all qualifications are equal. You know, if you were to speak to somebody from Germany about their approach to micro-credentials, and Serge made reference to this in our preparatory meeting, there's already a huge amount of vocational development that is created, and there's a question that would have in states like Germany, why do we need micro-credentials? We already have recognition pathways. We already have this. So I think we need to think about that. And I think there is actually a really good CEDAFOF report that talks about the national, I think Anastasia made reference, and has a reference there up on her own slides, about NQF and the development of NQF into more modernised ones, etc. Sheila's after giving you a really, really important presentation on Europath. I'm not going to go into that. I think the important bit that we need to get our head around is our registers for recognition. And then I think also one of the big things so we need to look at what we're recognising, and I think that how we're doing that also needs to be looked at. So I think that needs to happen at the state level, but it also has to happen at the European level as well. We have a huge amount of course catalogues and platforms coming on stream, and we have one of these in Ireland, and we know that we have a number of those, ECIU and another course catalogues. But I'm going to stop sharing at this point and maybe give an opportunity for a few questions if we can, Serge, if that's okay.
Who are the drivers, the organization that are behind micro-credentials? Who's pushing it? Because I remember when we were working with open badges, IBM was perfectly happy with badges. They worked perfectly well for what they wanted to do. And the idea of micro-credentials as they are now standardized, I'm not sure that it would add something to what they want to achieve. So would it be an overstatement to say that it's higher education which is mainly pushing for micro-credentials? Or is it industry-led? My impression is that it's more higher education which is trying to push micro-credentials than the industry. So could you comment on that?
If I can reply, Shares, can I? I think
Please.
I raised my hand, but yeah, that's a very nice question. Actually, this is a question we were also thinking back in 2020 before we started our research, and we focused specifically on VET and labor market, because what we saw there at that point in time, we saw a lot of activity taking place in higher education in any case, because higher education institutions are very important providers of learning, of education, like let's say at the upper levels, if we talk about NQF, EQF levels. But then if you really move away or forget or not really focus on what is actually needed by the labor market, as I also showed in my presentation, what is the kind of a push that comes from that part towards more traditional, non-flexible, let's say, systems where it's okay to have a degree and important formal qualifications. But what happens with what I think Yola mentioned that before, like the informal learning, or let's say the non-formal learning, which can be in any case part of a formal, let's say, system, but not necessarily recognized. I think that it's definitely labor market, and I would say the needs that are coming from the employment part, which somehow we know a lot of the difficulties of engaging with labor markets and stakeholders if you're already working in the education environment. So it's a bit of there's a tension, I would say. There's a tension, and quite often what we do at CEDAFOP, we use a very nice metaphor for a kind of a pendulum. If you think about the pendulum and the way the pendulum moves across different directions, so you are, on the one hand, you have like the labor market pushing education, like higher education, vocational education, but then at the same time, they need to react and somehow come together towards that direction. So I think it's a kind of a tension mainly, but definitely labor market has a strong role to play here. But I don't know if other colleagues would like to come on that.
I would like to add that it's not exactly higher education institutions that are pushing for micro-credentials. Doesn't matter whether it's the labor market or it's the industry, when they need a skill, they need to be able to see that the learner actually learned that skill. And in order to have that proof, you need some type of standard that you can follow. If not, I can just say that, oh, this person has learned how to weld something. It's just my word, unless I am known very well and they know that I am very impartial and judge them accordingly to the skills that are needed, that micro-credentials don't mean anything if I give it to. But when you look at the labor market or industry, if they need certain skill, it doesn't matter whether it's a higher education skill or low level skill, you need to have a way of having a proof of learning, and the standards help in that. And that's where the micro credential comes into the picture, because EU Commission, spent a lot of time in researching that and came up with, okay, it needs to have learning outcomes so that everybody knows what they learned. And yes, for some of the things you don't need assessment, but for a lot of the things, even in the industry, they would like to know whether they can actually do it. Did they pass? Assessment does not necessarily mean a written exam like the traditional way, right? You can do a project, a real world project on it, and that can be the assessment. So it can be looked at in different ways, but having a certain standard to show that this student learned and be able to put that into a micro-credential helps. With a badge, that was the issue. You cannot tell what it is. If the badge is given only if the student passed, then it is the same thing, right? You are assessing, you are looking at some learning outcome, whether the student learned or not. So it's not exactly coming from higher education institutions, or it's not just for higher education institutions, but it is for more generic, but looking at it to get a assessment feel, to get a feel of what the student learned, this would help.
Okay, you said it's not higher education, but associated to micro-credentials is the idea of a short unit of learning. So it is focused on learning. And you know this saying, which is to the person, to the person who has a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's you could imagine that for educators, everything should look like a course. And most of what we learn is outside of a course. Informal learning is on the field. But over maybe 90% of what we learn is informal. So why this focus on a small part of the learning, which is the formal and also the non-formal learning, and not providing the equipment for making the informal learning visible, which was the idea of open badges. So I like very much the slide from Meren, because you showed the whole spectrum of recognition, and micro-credentials was just one part of the spectrum. And I think, how do you reconcile all that, where if you think that there is this whole spectrum, do you think that you should promote the whole spectrum and not just focus on micro-credentials? So yes, you raise your hand, please.
I did, but Pauline had her hands raised before me, so I don't know if she wants to come in and say something. You're okay.
I will let you comment first, because I just wanted to push forward a question from the chat. So please answer first, and then.
Okay, I think from our perspective, it's not an either-or question, Serge, really, to be frank. I think when we were looking at it, we were trying to get a handle on it for structure. And I think from our perspective, we were trying to say, okay, how can we be as inclusive as possible? We didn't want to be excluding the learning that happens, as very rightly you say, in the informal arena. Like, I can tell you from perspectives on language learning, they would say the best language learning you will ever do will be the conversations you have with people that are never recorded in a classroom or whatever. That's absolutely fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think from a perspective, though, from where my institution or from a national efforts, etc., I think we have a long way to go to develop out that recognition infrastructure in a way by which we can replicate it and scale it and sustain it. And I think that's where we were trying to put structure onto it. And maybe for me, it's layers of an ecosystem. You know, when we spoke before, we spoke about the onion, and I think we really have to get that ecosystem into place. In Ireland, we have a recognition of prior learning, a major national project ongoing to help institutions across the sector to engage with that. And really, it's an upskilling for all of the institutions with respect to recognition. And that's as simple as terms. It's really getting us to understand how to do informal, non-formal better, because we can do, I think we all can do formal from an institutional perspective. We understand that it's not perfect, it's possibly not scalable in a lot of institutions, but we can definitely do it. So I think from that perspective, it's been hugely important. And I don't think you can talk about micro-credentials without talking about the recognition piece. But I think then you have to get down and you have to break that down. You know, you use, I think with me, that when we were preparing for this, the gardening, you know, of a gardener and guilds coming together of great gardeners and stuff. We already know that happens in jurisdictions where there are guilds, where that sort of tradition of having vocational organizations, they already have their standards and they have their standards mapped out and set out. So I don't think that then this is old wine in new bottles type of stuff. We can learn from those countries within Europe, thank God. We can learn from those countries that already have those type of systems in place and are already aligned within their ecosystem. And I think this is what it's all around. For me, all of the presentations, whether it's from Anastasia or it's from Sheila, we're trying to get to a more advanced system of education and training that is more both advanced but also more inclusive. And that for me is important. So whether you call it micro-credentials or it's something else in 5 years' time, I don't really mind. What I'm writing for is that we are taking into account the different forms of learning. And if you want to be very, you know, you can be either hugely commercial about this or hugely sort of thing, say we need this to upskill and have people and get them to do different things. Or you just say, actually, we need more people to be learning. We need more people to be educationally engaged. And I think that's okay. That's important. And you can go back to the Knowledge Society and all that type of stuff for theory on this and for value and all of that type of stuff. But I actually think there's a more important fundamental thing around this. So a very long answer to a simple question, but simply we were trying to put structure on it, to think about it and to make sure that we could support interoperability of all of those different types of learning.
Pauline.
Yes, I just wanted to take the question from Andrea Inamorato, who asked what are the main challenges for stackability at the moment?
Do you want me to answer that? Because I brought stackability up. I thought we can't do a micro-credentials presentation without talking about stackability. For me, I think the issue is that we're so used to building qualifications and awards top down. We really can think about it. I think what we're challenging, and this comes from what I previously said, for this inclusivity bit and for recognizing people's learning independent of the place or the recognition that it has had. And I think the formal recognition that it has had. So I think that's what's challenging institutions. And I think Anastasia made the point of learning outcomes. If we boil everything down to what we have and what we need, you know, the essential seed is learning outcomes. But learning outcomes for us in an education and training perspective mean this, and they mean completely something else then on the other side, or the multiple sides of the kaleidoscope, as I say. So when I know having dealt with lots of industry and different societal partners, when we try to go through a process to translate their needs and requirements or labour market needs requirements into actual learning outcomes, that's a very useful process because it has to go through multiple iterations for people to understand it. So I think the stackability issue is not going to be solved overnight because it's a bigger question. But I also think it's something that we can take baby steps towards, because we need to take baby steps towards it if we're going to have this ecosystem approach to education and training, which I think micro-credentials is a driver for.
Yes, Anastasia, you want maybe you be able to respond to another question I have, which is about Europass. Will micro-credential have to be with an e-seal in order to be in Europass, or any kind of micro-credential, even without an e-seal, will be able to be displayed on Europass?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I actually wanted to reply a bit and to add on what Yola said before on the stackability aspect, but because and for Europass, if I may, but because I think we also discussed it some time ago, because SEDEF was very much involved in the Europass folder, but then now it's with the European Commission part to reply, let's say, the developments with regards to the Europass file, but just a bit to already add a bit on the stackability, and then if I can say for Europass, at least on the stackability aspect, I think this is very important and is very much also linked if we are discussing a bit this topic of, let's say, the link between, let's say, existing shorter units of learning and their potential integration in the current existing qualification framework. Then it's interesting. We really need to see whether a kind of a framework would be opening up to qualifications outside the formal system in any case. And we have examples from the monitoring exercise we do at SEDEF on which countries are in this case. And in that particularity, then it would be possible to stack. Of course, for example, another interesting case is the Bloc de Compétences in France, which actually, very shorter parts, modules of, let's say, of learning and how it is for, let's say, recognized in their system and how important it is, this shorter pathway. And also very much linked to that, like, for example, now we have in Spain an interesting development where they have a kind of a legal arrangement, a new law, the organic law for VET, for the ordination integration on VET. And then there they try to potentially to create a situation where micro-credentials can be stacked and can be leading to a formal VET certificate under this specific new law. There's a kind of a legal arrangement in place. Now the Europass, because you refer to e-seal, and I think our other speaker, Skila, you already mentioned that on the e-seal and the particular case. I think that in any case, when you have a kind of a more official stamp, which is based on specific standards behind and process, then it's always good to have an important element. But I think we are still a bit a bit away from that, to be honest, because already what we saw is that countries don't understand the concept. Then it's first you understand what is a kind of a microcredential within the specific national context, and then the idea to potentially to issue it in what format. If it's a kind of a digital one, then again to have specific requirements in place, and of course the stamp, the e-seal, that's another aspect. So I think there are different steps to be considered, but I would definitely highlight and stop here is that the learning outcomes is an important parameter behind all of these discussions, but then we need to consider it's not the intended learning outcomes, what you are intending to learn, but the actual achieved learning outcomes, the way like you demonstrate your performance in real working environments or any types of skills and knowledge you would have acquired. So I think that, yeah, not directly into the e-seal discussion, but in the way how you issue, in what form you're issuing a kind of a micro-credential. But I think I see the other speaker raise their hand maybe on that. So I will pass the floor to her.
I just wanted to add, when you ask about Europass, there's it used to be Europass for one, but now Europass has its own this thing. Europass is not actually a anything to do with the digital credentials or micro credentials. Europass is like a digital wallet for everybody. Anybody can have a wallet. So like I have a Europass wallet where I can put any of the micro credentials I get into there. I can put my CV. I can get even a certificate of completion from say LinkedIn or anywhere else I get. It's my wallet where I can put it. The advantage with the micro credentials comes also with the ease of sharing. With the PDF document, yes, of course I can share. I can forward it in an email. But how do they know that that's the actual PDF I got from from the where I learned, or whether it's informal, formal does not matter. It doesn't prove that I actually got it. With the micro-credentials, or I should say digital credentials. Micro-credentials are like learning experience and also the digital credential that comes with it. When we talk about the European digital credentials, the advantage is you can share it easily and you own it. So another issue that that Europass and European digital credentials is solving is also the self-sovereignty, right? Till now, I got my master's degree from Washington State University in US. When I came to Finland and I was applying for my PhD, I had to request Washington State University to send a signed copy of my master's degree to the Tampere University. Tampere University will not accept if I give my copy of my master's degree. I have my degree, right? Or the paper copy of it. I cannot give a copy of it. They will not trust it. It has to come from the university. And it's my degree and I have no ownership of it. I cannot share it. I cannot do anything with it. It has to go back to the university. And this micro-credentials and the European digital credentials, I would not even say micro-credentials, the European digital credentials, one of the things it's solving is ownership. When I have this EDC, I can share it, and when I share it with Tampere University, it can trust that it is true because it can show whether it's tamper-proof or not. It can be verified easily. So Europass helps with that by giving that free digital wallet for everybody to put them.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it's a good occasion to say that we will be organizing several events in the future, because it was the first one of a series for the project. So it's my turn to thank you all, thank our speakers, and we're sorry for this technical issues. We may have had more people joining, but it will be a next time. And again, thank you, Sheila, thank you, Marianne, thank you, Anastasia. It was really great insight for our project.
Thank you, Pauline.
Thank
it was our pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Merci. Au revoir.
Merci.
Thank you.
Bye.
Adio.
Bye.